Asylum seekers staying in federally funded hotels will soon have to check out as Immigration and Refugees and Citizenship Canada says that funding will end in September. A spokesperson for the IRCC confirmed that the federal government was housing 485 asylum seekers in 5 hotels in Ontario and Quebec, noting that it has spent approximately $1.1 billion on temporary hotel housing for asylum seekers since 2020. I'm now joined by our contributor, David Clement, for more on the change. David, I want to start with the $1.1 billion figure. How did Canada end up spending over $1 billion on housing asylum seekers in hotel, and how many asylum claims have there been in Canada since 2020?
Yeah, so starting with the latter part of that question. So 2020, 26,000 asylum seekers. 2021, only 4,000.
Mhm.
Makes sense because of COVID, you couldn't
Right.
travel. 2022, 40,000, but this is where things really start to get interesting. 2023, 146,000. 2024, 172,000. So a huge uptick
Mhm.
in asylum claims. How did we get to $1.1 billion? Well, in some senses, it was a lifeline for the hotels
Mhm.
because COVID destroyed the
Right.
industry, and the government had to figure out a way in which to house this influx of asylum seekers. There were these empty rooms in areas that there was no tourism demand at all
Mhm.
because of COVID, and so that would be kind of the charitable description of how we ended up in this scenario. Um, Part of the problem on the $1.1 billion figure is that it's not cheap to put somebody in a hotel long term. It's
Mhm.
about, I think the average they quoted was $205 per day, accommodation and food. That's more than $70,000 a year. And so I think the rough numbers right now are about 58,000 asylum seekers were in hotels since 2020. So that's a high price tag for 58,000 people. And it's starting to drum up a lot of questions about how did we get here and why did this cost so much?
And what's the difference between an asylum seeker and a refugee?
And that's an important distinction. So, because most people treat them the same,
Mhm.
their claims might be the same, right? They can't go back because they might be persecuted or they're fleeing war. The difference between a refugee and asylum seeker, so a refugee is almost always vetted and processed through an international agency like the UNHCR.
Mhm.
So the legitimacy of their claim is determined before they get to Canada. An asylum seeker is someone who gets to one of our borders, our airport or land crossing, and says, I'm seeking asylum. I'm requesting to seek asylum because if I go home, then I will be persecuted. I fear for my life. Either claim may be legitimate. The difference is that the legitimacy of the claim for the asylum seeker is determined once they're already in Canada. And that is where things become increasingly difficult because, as you could understand, there's a long process to figure out somebody's claim. Are they who they say they are? What are they fearing in terms of persecution? What evidence can they present to prove that they meet whatever the threshold is? Where a refugee has already had that done in advance.
Mhm.
More often than not, an example would be during the Syrian crisis. In a refugee camp run by the UN, they're processed and the legitimacy of their claim is then approved, and then they're on the list, and then they end up in Canada or any other Western country.
And what has been the response from the public on that $1.1 billion figure?
Overwhelmingly negative, because when you map out more than $70,000 per day, that's more than the average income.
Mhm.
And it's not that that doesn't undermine the legitimacy of someone's asylum claim, but it does create a really nasty backlash about immigration, about newcomers, because people of modest means who are struggling to get by or having to rely on food banks, which
Mhm.
you've reported on countless times over the last year or so, may look at that figure and say, wait a second, I, I'm here, I'm struggling. This is a really uncomfortable scenario where the federal government is spending a lot of money per person, in this case, to put them in hotels. So the pushback has been pretty negative, just because it's hard to justify that big ticket price tag when so many Canadians are struggling on their own. And again, that doesn't undermine. It's not the asylum seekers' fault. This was the system that
Hmm.
Ottawa created. They didn't create this system. They didn't lobby for it or advocate for it, and neither did the cities. In many instances, there are scenarios where the federal government just coordinated directly with the hotels and didn't even speak to the municipalities in advance. And so that leaves a lot of open-ended questions about what happens next with this program winding down.
And asylum seekers have been facing a lot of the backlash
Mhm.
for what's been happening from Canadians. But should Ottawa be taking more of the hit? Should it be on Ottawa's shoulders that they should have dealt with this properly, or they should continue to map out and figure out how to take care of Canadians that are here while also bringing in
Yeah,
refugees and asylum seekers?
yeah, it's one part of communications problem because you have to get ahead of it and explain. You either have to justify the cost or you have to make a conscious effort to uh, make the program more efficient.
Hmm.
There was actually a program that was proposed that was then axed to make the asylum process more efficient. It's not to stereotype collaborating with the government, but they still rely on paper
Hmm.
for a lot of their files, and that obviously slows things down. When you want to modernize that process, that could at least speed up the process for how these claims are adjudicated and eliminate the wait time. I mean, if we look at the figures, they're not particularly good. The average from start to finish for an asylum seeker could be as high, or the average is 44 months. They have a goal of 80% by 2 years. That's a long time. That is a long time waiting to see if your asylum claim is legitimate and if you have the right to stay. And so I don't know why Ottawa scrapped some of the modernization plans, but it should have been an eye opener in Ottawa that, okay, we need to get our act together. How do we streamline this so that it's as effective and efficient and
Hmm.
safe as possible, rather than relying on paper and waiting 44
Right.
months for someone. And think about the person who's made the claim,
Hmm.
right? You're stuck in limbo for 44 months. What you decide to do with your life in that time period is fundamentally different. If you know you're going to be able to stay, you put down roots,
Hmm.
employment, build a family, you become a member of society. If you spend 44 months not knowing and thinking you might be forced to go back to where you don't want to go back to, it completely changes the dynamics of how you engage in Canadian society.
Now, I want to go back to the funding.
Mhm.
Where has this push to end funding come from, and what happens next?
So mostly come from the fact that we are heavily indebted. So the CD Howe Institute estimates that we're looking between 70 to 90 billion deficits.
Hmm.
Um, that is a big price tag. And across the board, the Carney government has this monumental task of trying to make government more efficient while also promising to increase defense spending, while also providing tax relief on things like first-time home buyers um, and zeroing the carbon tax and all of
Hmm.
those things. But at the end of the day, our revenue shortfall is fairly significant, and so this would be one of the programs spending wise that's on the chopping block in terms of where the money's going to go. What happens next is a big question because all of the mayors in the cities are wondering, well, when this dries up, if this isn't a place for asylum seekers to go, where do they go? In
Hmm.
Toronto, many of them were filling up the homeless shelters,
Right.
which is not the point. It's not the purpose of a homeless shelter to be housing newcomers. If Ottawa is going to be determining the rate in which people come to Canada, or at least creating the circumstances for the delay, they have to have some skin in the game in terms of fixing it. And so the worry on the provinces and the municipality side is that we'll still have all of these people in the backlog, but they won't have the hotels to live in. And so are they going to go to homeless shelters? What happens next? That's where it's an open question.
Well, we've seen the rise in asylum seekers, as you've mentioned, from 2020 and on. It
Mhm.
started with COVID and it has slowly continued. What do you think needs to happen for this? I mean, obviously, continue to take in asylum seekers and continue to house them and support them. But I don't think the answer is cutting funding because, like you just said, then you're relying on the homeless shelters and things like that that are meant for other people. So,
Yeah.
what would the next step be? What should the government be doing to keep everyone in the country happy?
Yeah. So I think part of the solution has to be shrinking the wait time.
Mhm.
And so part of the Carney government's border bill mandates now that asylum seekers have to make their claim within a year.
Right.
So they have to submit their paperwork to prove the legitimacy of their claim within a year. That should hopefully at least help with some of the backlog in terms of the delay between arriving and submitting your formal claim. Is that enough? Probably not. There have been some efforts to reduce immigration more generally, but it's different with asylum seekers because we don't actually control the amount of asylum seekers that come here. They arrive here on their own dollar,
Mhm.
get to a border agent and say, I'm claiming asylum. And we have legal obligations internationally to not turn them away. And so long as Canada is a desirable place for these people to live in, we're stuck.
David, thank you for the time.
Thank you.